The VTC meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, implications of COVID-19. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefer to participate in this meeting. Mr. Peter Maurer, President, International Committee of the Red Cross, and Her Excellency, African Union Commissioner for Social Affairs, Almira El Fadil Mohamed. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2020/571, a letter dated 22 June 2020 from the Permanent Representative of Germany to the UN, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept note on the item under consideration. I wish to, in the name of Minister Maas, to warmly welcome the Secretary General, Madam Commissioner, the distinguished ministers and other high-level representatives. Your presence today underscores the importance of the subject matter under discussion. I would like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to France and thank Minister Yves Le Drian on behalf of the Council for their excellent presidency during the month of June, in which we have dealt with a number of crucial questions and made progress on important issues. France and Tunisia, as penholders, have negotiated the resolution on COVID-19 that we were able to adopt yesterday, and which the Council was now finally able to back Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire, and we commend France and Tunisia in particular for their efforts, which Germany and others always fully backed. This has been a great success, and Resolution 2532 gives us tailwind for today's discussion and our future cooperation concerning COVID-19. Mr. Secretary General, you, more than anybody else, have addressed the threat to peace and security arising from the consequences of COVID-19 pandemic early on. We thank you for your call for a global ceasefire that is a crucial element of what the world needs to do to alleviate the consequences of the pandemic in the most vulnerable settings. We are pleased to back your efforts as a Council with Resolution 2532 we were able to adopt yesterday, and are hoping to do more in this respect in the time to come. I now give the floor to Secretary General, His Excellency Mr. Antonio Guterres. You have the floor.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I must start by apologizing. I will be extremely unpolite, involuntarily, but this meeting had to be squeezed in an already very packed agenda, so I will have to leave almost immediately after speaking, which is something I hate to do facing the distinguished members of the Council. So, my apologies. I thank the German presidency for convening this important discussion. The COVID-19 pandemic continues to profoundly affect peace and security across the globe. The consequences can be seen even in a number of countries traditionally seen as stable. But the impacts are particularly apparent in countries already experiencing conflict or emerging from it, and may soon engulf others. The risks are diverse. Tensions are rising as a result of severe socio-economic fallout of the crisis. Trust in public institutions is being eroded further in places where people perceive that authorities have not addressed the pandemic effectively or have not been transparent about its impact. As pre-existing grievances and vulnerabilities become more accentuated and entrenched, the potential for instability and violence only grows. The pandemic is exacerbating gender inequalities, as women make up the vast majority of the sectors most affected. There has been an alarming spike in gender-based and domestic violence, and it is increasingly difficult for victims to report abuse, seek shelter, and access justice. In some countries, fragile peace processes could be derailed by the crisis, especially if the international community is distracted. In Darfur, for example, the pandemic and other challenges have led to repeated extension of the deadline for the completion of the Juba peace process. In other places, conflict actors, including terrorist and violent extremist groups, see the uncertainty created by the pandemic as a tactical advantage. In Somalia, Al-Shabaab continues to launch frequent attacks with no noticeable impact of COVID-19 on its operational tempo. Rather, there is a risk that Al-Shabaab could increase such violence while security forces focus by necessity on the pandemic. Many countries have had to consider how to move ahead with elections slated for 2020 while trying to manage the health crisis. Since March of this year, 18 elections or referenda have been held since the onset of the pandemic, 24 have been postponed, and the initial dates for 39 elections have been maintained to date. In the Central African Republic, there are tensions due to the attempts to use the pandemic as a pretext to postpone the holding of elections planned for the end of the year. Decisions on postponing or indeed proceeding with elections raise complex legal, political, and public health challenges. Difficult as they are, such decisions are best made on the basis of broad consultations with all stakeholders to avoid fueling political tensions or undermining legitimacy. COVID-19 has also made diplomacy more challenging. Mediation can be a very personal endeavour, an almost tactile reading of a person or a room. With movement restrictions limiting such contacts, and with online discussions often the only alternative, it can be harder to establish the trust and nurture the willingness to compromise that are at the heart of preventive diplomacy. Excellencies, the pandemic also highlights the risks of bioterrorist attacks and has already shown some of the ways in which preparedness might fall short if a disease were to be deliberately manipulated to be more virulent or intentionally released in multiple places at once. So, as we consider how to improve our response to future disease threats, we should also devote serious attention to preventing the deliberate use of diseases as weapons. The Biological Weapons Convention codifies a strong and long-standing norm against the abhorrent use of disease as a weapon, and now has 183 states parties. I urge the 14 states that have not yet joined the Convention to do so without any further delay. We also need to strengthen the Convention, which lacks an oversight institution and contains no verification provisions, by enhancing its role as a forum for the consideration of preventive measures, robust response capacities, and effective countermeasures. Fortunately, the best counter to biological weapons is effective action against naturally occurring diseases. Strong public and veterinary health systems are not only an essential tool against COVID-19, but also an effective deterrent against the development of biological weapons. All of these issues must be on the agenda next year at the Convention's review conference. At the moment, the Secretary-General's mechanism, established by the General Assembly and endorsed by the Security Council, is the only instrument that provides a framework for an investigation of alleged use of biological weapons. Security Council Resolution 1540 and its follow-ups remain a key component of the international non-proliferation architecture, and are providing an overarching framework to prevent the nightmare scenario of bioterrorism. Given the speed at which pathogens spread in an interconnected world, we must ensure that all countries have resilient and appropriate capacities to respond quickly and robustly to any potential global and deliberate biological event. Excellencies, I'm also concerned that the pandemic is triggering or exacerbating human rights challenges. My call to action for human rights is more relevant than ever and requires robust follow-up. We have seen the excessive use of force to police lockdowns, curfews, and other confinement measures. And there are growing manifestations of authoritarianism, including limits on the media, civic space, and freedom of expression. Populists, nationalists, and others who are already seeking to roll back human rights are finding it in the pandemic a pretext for repressive measures unrelated to the disease. And meanwhile, stigma and hate speech are on the rise. And an epidemic of misinformation online has run rampant. To help counter the spread of untruthful and harmful information, the United Nations has launched the Verified initiative to increase the volume and reach of trusted, accurate information surrounding the crisis. Yet another risk for the long term is the shifting of resources away from gender equality initiatives, education, and other economic sectors. Indeed, this could have intergenerational impacts, including on human rights and participation in political and peace processes. And most immediately, humanitarian needs have surged. More than 1 billion children out of school. More than 135 million people could be on the brink of starvation by the end of this year. Routine immunization services are being disrupted on an unprecedented scale, raising the likelihood of major outbreak of diseases like measles and polio. The already acute vulnerability of refugees and internally displaced persons has grown more pronounced, particularly those living in confined and congested camps and detention facilities. And healthcare workers and humanitarian personnel have themselves been targeted for unconscionable attacks. The health pandemic has fast become a protection crisis. Excellencies, these wide-ranging risks require an urgent and united response, including from the Security Council. 180 members plus one member observer state have endorsed my call for a global ceasefire, as have more than 20 armed movements and other entities and more than 800 civil society organizations. The call yielded some positive results, but these have since expired or in some cases broken down. The Council has an important role to bring its voice and influence to bear on these situations, and I welcome your support expressed in the resolution adopted yesterday. Our peacekeeping operations and special political missions continue to bring hope and stability to all corners of the world, supporting national authorities and vulnerable communities, including by ensuring that missions themselves are not a vector of contagion. We have put in place a number of medical and other support measures to mitigate the spread of the virus within our missions and to protect our personnel. And we have also adapted the positions of our uniformed personnel, for which we are grateful to troop and police contributing countries. The rotations of our uniformed personnel. We are also adapting our tools to the new circumstances. In Colombia and Libya, for example, we have been able to maintain a good level of engagement with the parties and other actors using virtual and other means. The Office of the Special Envoy for Yemen carries out a first-of-its-kind large-scale virtual dialogue with more than 500 Yemenis, 35% of whom are women, on the opportunities and challenges for peace in the country. And through a global humanitarian response plan, we are addressing the most urgent health and humanitarian needs in 63 countries, although the plan is just 21% funded and much more is needed. Excellencies, since the beginning of the crisis, the United Nations family has mounted a comprehensive response, providing medical and material support on the ground, advocating for a global economic and financial rescue package, and offering policy analysis across the key dimensions of the emergency. The pandemic has brought us all to a wide-range reckoning. Collective security and our shared well-being are under assault on many fronts, led by a relentless disease and abetted by global fragilities. Our challenge is to save lives today while buttressing the pillars of security for tomorrow. I remain ready to support the Security Council in any way possible, as this body carries out its essential part of the response. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Secretary General, for your intervention. We understand that you have to leave early. We very much appreciate that on short notice we are ready to join us. I now give the floor to Mr. Peter Maurer.
Mr. Chair, Ministers, Excellencies, thank you for the opportunity to brief you and to address you today. Conflict zones are the sharp end of pandemics. Communities are already living on a knife edge where additional shocks can be catastrophic. The ICRC is seeing firsthand how COVID-19 and its economic aftershock are deepening fragility, spiking humanitarian needs, accentuating the impact of violence and conflict, opening the doors to alarming levels of stigmatization, increasing global poverty, heightening instability and tensions, and reversing hard-won development gains. It is clear that pandemics cannot be addressed solely as a health issue. Instead, the precondition is a political environment which supports health systems, social supports, and humanitarian action, simultaneous emergency and development approaches, as well as fundamental change of behavior of belligerents in conflict. Unquestionably, pandemics are changing humanitarian work. We already know that needs are vast and growing. According to our legal analysis, there are now around 100 armed conflicts around the world, involving 60 states and more than 100 non-state armed groups as parties to those conflicts. This represents a steady rise in the total number of classified conflicts over the recent decades. ICRC is drawing lessons from the impact of COVID-19 across these conflicts, as well as the experiences of other infectious diseases like Ebola, cholera, or tuberculosis. Today, I bring to your attention 6 essential lessons for a pandemic response in humanitarian settings. Firstly, international humanitarian law must be better respected to protect civilians and their infrastructure from multiple future shocks, including pandemics. Violations of IHL, cities bombed to rubble, mass displacements, often the consequences, are the enemy of pandemic response. Countries where health services have been destroyed by war stand little chance to treat or contain COVID-19. Emergency room mortality rates are spiking dramatically. Attacks, including cyber attacks on healthcare workers and facilities, are continuing unabatedly. Health workers and humanitarians are our first and last lines of defense, and they must be protected. Words and promises, resolutions like 2286, which has been agreed by this Council, are fruitless if they do not result in meaningful changes of behaviors on the ground. Positive influence by those who have leverage over parties to conflict must be a priority. ICRC is doing our share by training millions of health workers around the world on implementing protective measures, fighting stigma, and maintaining neutral and impartial services in the midst of war and violence. Secondly, assistance and protection must be available to all those in need without the threat of politicization or manipulation. Under international law, impartial humanitarian aid cannot come with strings attached to be withheld from so-called enemy groups. People's needs are the only reasonable basis on which to respond. Misinformation and exclusionary responses can fuel unrest and instability. Today, the distribution of scarce medicine and protective materials are triggering violent flare-ups. Tomorrow, the inequitable distribution of any COVID-19 vaccine could destabilize communities. The Red Cross and Red Crescent movement has joined the UN Secretary General in calling for a people's vaccine, which ensure no one is left out. Once vaccines will be available, their equitable distribution will be critical. We are working to plan with states and with millions of Red Cross and Red Crescent workers all over the world to help to mitigate against potentially very dangerous situations when vaccines will be available. Thirdly, the response must go far beyond health needs and mitigate the wider secondary impacts of pandemic. Pandemic response cannot be reduced to the delivery of masks or confined to emergency rooms. Communities need measures to guard against the multiple dimensions of fragility, health and sanitation systems, social safety nets, and livelihoods. There are no silver bullets, but where people are hit by double burden of conflict and disease, context-specific, evidence-driven approaches will balance the imperatives of controlling infectious disease and mitigate against secondary impacts. I warn against compartmentalization of the response into humanitarian or development action. We must enable emergency and long-term responses, preventive and curative responses in sync. And it is possible. ICRC has seen a growing recognition that inhumane conditions, for example, in detention or displacement camps, can become deadly during a pandemic, not only for those interned and incarcerated, but for the host communities. In detention facilities in more than 50 countries, the ICRC is working with the authorities to strengthen healthcare and hygiene measures. We have seen such measures effectively prevent the spread of cholera and Ebola in places of detention in Guinea, Liberia, and the DRC a couple of years ago. By responding to health needs, it's possible to improve inhumane conditions for longer term and diffuse rising tensions in communities. The ICRC has delivered more than 200 confidential reports to authorities concerned over the past few months on the conditions in detention facilities, made recommendations on system-wide improvements, covering health, sanitation, hygiene services, overcrowding, family contact, ill treatment, and judicial processes. We commend the many authorities worldwide who have responded positively to our recommendations and who have prevented a degradation of their security environment. Fourthly, responses must be built to reach the most vulnerable and marginalized community members. No one is safe from a pandemic until everyone is safe. Pandemics will affect some people more than others. We must ensure responses reach those less visible and silenced. For example, displaced people, those working in the informal sector, those in areas controlled by non-state armed groups, people detained, people with disabilities, the elderly, racial minorities, women and girls, as well as sexual and gender minorities. We must look at the landscape of needs rather than creating trade-offs between the COVID response and other responses. The war wounded, those with chronic diseases must still be treated. Mental health and sexual violence responses must be scaled up to dramatically increased needs. Livelihood assistance and other social supports must be boosted as a critical preventive measures. Failure to do so will nurture the cycle of exclusion, violence, and conflict. Fifthly, we must proactively guard against any rollback of civilian protections. Government must not exploit the pandemic and set draconian precedents which undermine international humanitarian law and human rights law. Any exceptional measures to fight and contain the pandemic must be time-bound, non-discriminatory, and proportional to public health needs. We urge wider implementation of the good practices of granting exceptions to humanitarians whenever possible. Humanitarian organizations are ready to do their job and their part for additionally precautionary measures in that work. Given the mistrust and heightened tensions in areas of violence and conflicts, states need to be especially vigilant to ensure that laws restricting the use of force are thoroughly applied. This should be followed through to ensure rules of conduct and training are in place, as well as robust oversight of security forces. Checks and balances must be in place so emergency measures such as lockdowns or wide-scale data collection are not used as abusive tools to control populations or undermine public trust in health measures. Temporary restrictions on humanitarian access must not become fixed. And finally, responses will only be effective if there is community trust and engagement. The global COVID response is a game changer for state citizens' trust. Healthcare at gunpoint is futile. Even in conflict-affected environments, local authorities can build trust by listening to communities and acting with transparency. Responders also need to be trusted and stigma combated. ICRC, together with the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and its existing community networks, is often one of the few responders in contested areas. We see there is no substitute for neutral and impartial humanitarian action which secures the trust of populations and the trust of authorities across front lines and the so-called last mile of service delivery. Trust can be achieved by listening to the plight of communities, by walking the talk, by engaging and cooperating with local leaders and faith-based organizations and religious leaders. On the front lines of fighting the pandemic, the convergence of health and security is not a matter of political debate, but of simple and experienced truth. Colleagues, even in these uncertain times, we have the knowledge and the lessons on how to tackle COVID-19. Much can be done in this Council and beyond. The passing of UN Security Council Resolution 2532 represents a chance to reset, to translate the consensus reflected in the text into greater cooperation and action to protect civilians. The choices are there. Choose to respect the ceasefire, choose to intensify diplomacy to make it happen, choose to enable humanitarian access, including facilitating movement, choose to follow the laws you created in international humanitarian law, choose to give space to first responders and local communities. Millions around the world are depending on you to make the right choices that protect them from the health crises of the future. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Maurer for his briefing, and let me say thanks, Peter, for your important work especially in times like these. And now let me first say hello to all and apologize for being late. We had a technical problem, but now we are online and it's good to see you all. Thanks to Ambassador Heusgen for leading us through the first minutes of this meeting. And now let's go on, dear colleagues. Now I give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Amira El-Fadil, Mohamed El-Fadil.
Thank you very much, Minister. Thank you to the German presidency for inviting the African Union, members of the Council. Good evening from Addis Ababa, the headquarters of the African Union. Excellencies, as we speak today, the situation, the epidemiological situation in Africa is as follows. We have 418,000 infected cases. We have 10,400 deaths. We have 198,000 recoveries. We continue to be the least affected continent, but that doesn't mean that the risk is less than the rest of the world. The risk is still very high in Africa. We are still looking to countries that have not yet go into the spike. Excellencies, the African Union heads of states and governments under the chairmanship of the President of South Africa, the chair of the African Union, they have decided in their meeting on the 26th of March that Africa will act together. Africa will fight COVID-19 together in solidarity and in unity. And they agreed also that the African Union will lead this fight by the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention, which is our specialized technical institution at the African Union. So what we are doing now in the African Union, we are leading the continent, we are leading in the fight against COVID-19 as being decided by the Bureau of the Assembly. Excellencies, we acted together as African Union, but I can say that we have started early because when we convened the meeting of the Ministers of Health, which is an emergency meeting on the 22nd of February, it was only 1 week after the first case was reported in the continent. So we tried as Africa to work together and to act quickly, and we managed to adopt our joint continental strategy on COVID-19. It was adopted by the Ministers of Health, but later endorsed by the Bureau of the Assembly. We have early also worked with our member states to identify the gaps we have in Africa. We have fragile health systems in many of our African member states. So the first thing we did is in the area of diagnostics. We realized that at the beginning of this pandemic, we have only 2 laboratories that have the capability to diagnose COVID-19. So the first thing we did is we trained the lab technician. We built the capacity of our member states. Now, almost all of our member states, they have the capacity to diagnose. And this for us is one of the successes we managed to do in a very short time. We continue to build the capacity of our member states. We continue to do the online training because of the measures taken, like the lockdowns and the stopping of the mobility. We are using internet. We are continuing with the training and the capacity building of the health professionals in our member states. And also we have tried to resolve the issue of the budget, because also budget is a challenge. Having enough financial resources to fight COVID-19 was a challenge. That's why our also leaders, they decided to establish the anti-COVID-19 response fund. The fund was established and member states, they made pledges. In one meeting, there is $61.5 million pledges made. But also I would like to thank all of the partners and the member states who also mobilized and made pledges to our fund. And I don't want to name countries, but many of your countries, they are also part of the resource mobilization in Africa. They are part also of the pledges made to Africa. And also we decided on a pool procurement processes. And we established an electronic medical platform. It was established by the private sector of Africa. Now all our member states, they have the opportunity to buy from the manufacturers, because through this platform, we have identified the manufacturers, we have negotiated the prices, because as you know, Excellencies, that very few medical items are produced locally in Africa. The majority of the items that's needed for the fight of COVID-19 are not manufactured in the continent. And that's why we have established this pool procurement electronic platform, and the private sector is involved heavily in this, and they were assigned by President Ramaphosa to do this job, and they did it very well. And now our member states, they can access the platform and they can buy the medical products they need to buy, and also with the best prices they can get. Excellencies, also we have briefed our Peace and Security Council here at the African Union. The Peace and Security Council convened 5 meetings since the beginning of this pandemic. They are very supportive to our effort in the Department of Social Affairs and Africa CDC. And also they have instructed the Air Force in member states to support our efforts by lifting and deploying the rapid responders we are sending from the headquarters, and we are sending from DRC, those who are working on fighting Ebola in DRC. We are now using them. We are sending them to member states. We have sent rapid responder to 12 member states, and we got the support of our Peace and Security Council here at the African Union. Excellencies, also we have also joined the call at the African Union. We have joined the call made by the Secretary General on the global ceasefire to reduce the effect of the conflict and on COVID-19, and Africa and African Union, we joined this call. We called upon member states in Africa and all those who are carrying guns, especially this year, 2020, for us in the African Union is a year of silencing the guns in Africa. We are calling upon them to cease fires, because one of the tools, the effective tools we are using, and it's being used globally to fight this COVID-19, is to do more testing. And we have launched a PACT initiative, which is partnership to accelerate testing in Africa. The problem is in the conflict zone areas, we cannot access these areas to do the testing. And that's increase the risk for the people in this area. Also, we are also very much concerned about the human rights of those people that are in the vulnerable situations, migrants, refugees, IDPs, accessibility to all these populations to have to be covered by the response we are doing, to be covered by the response that being done on the level of the member states, to be part of the testing. It's really a very big challenge. That's why we need the collaboration of all of you. We need the collaboration of ICRC, and also we need the specialized agencies like IOM and UNHCR to be with us to make sure that these populations that are in vulnerable situations, they can be covered by the activities we are doing as an African Union. So we need the support in this area. Excellencies, also one of the areas that we are working on is fighting gender-based violence, and it's been mentioned also in the statement by the Secretary General. There is an increase in the domestic violence. There is an increase in the violence against children because also of the impact of this COVID-19, the psychological and mental impact, also because of people staying at home, the socioeconomic impact of this COVID-19, that people are losing their jobs, they are losing their incomes. So these all challenges is reflecting itself in an increased domestic violence, and this is one of the areas we are working also with our partners, we are working with our member states to address these issues and to make sure that our communities and our people, they will be more aware, they will be helped and supported to minimize the risk on the women and children. Excellencies, I would like also to share with you that we are working on the area of development of vaccines. We don't want our continent to be left behind if a vaccine is developed. There is clinical trials here and there in Africa, in a few countries on the continent, but also we know that globally there is many clinical trials going on, and any minute a vaccine can be developed and can be licensed. So we want to raise our voices loudly to say that we don't want Africa to be left behind. We want the vaccine to be for everybody, accessible, affordable to everybody, because this pandemic, if it's not over in every part of the globe, it will not be considered over. So for everybody to be safe, we have to make sure that everybody will have the opportunity to access the vaccines. We had in the past experiences that vaccines has been developed. It took many years for these vaccines to be accessible to the African population. So this time we are talking early. Our leaders have joined the global efforts. They were part of the Gavi Summit. We were part of all the events that been held to speak about vaccines, and we want to make sure that Africa will have an accessibility to the vaccine if vaccines are developed. At the end of my remarks, Excellencies, I would like to say that we are doing our best in the continent. We are doing the maximum possible in our capacity as member states of Africa, as an African Union. We have a very clear vision on what we want to do. We have our mechanisms in place. We have our ministerial coordinating committees. We have our task force that's working daily, coordinating all the efforts on the level of the continent. And we have pooled our resources to make sure that Africa will win this fight against the COVID-19. But what we need more support we need this solidarity that we are experiencing as Africa. We want it to be a global solidarity. We want to join the efforts of the globe to make sure that we will do this fight together. We want also not to be left behind. If a vaccine is developed, we want not to be left behind. If a medication also is approved, we are working very closely with WHO. We are aligning our policies with WHO policies, and we are working very closely also on the ground. Excellency, thank you very much again for inviting the African Union, and we commit ourselves to be working with you very closely to silence the guns in Africa and to make sure that peace will prevail in the continent. Thank you very much.
I thank Ms. El-Fadil for her briefing very much. And now I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Jean-Yves Le Drian, Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs of France. But first, I would like to take this opportunity again to pay tribute to France and thank my colleague Jean-Yves Le Drian for their excellent presidency during the month of June. Un grand merci. Et Jean-Yves, vous avez la parole.
Merci Eiko, merci monsieur le Président, monsieur le Président du CICR, madame la commissaire de l'Union africaine, mes chers collègues, mesdames et messieurs, je souhaiterais d'abord remercier mon ami Eiko Maas d'avoir pris l'initiative d'organiser cette réunion en début de la présidence allemande du Conseil de sécurité. Je tiens également à saluer et à remercier le secrétaire général des Nations Unies, le président du CICR et la commissaire de l'Union africaine pour le travail remarquable de leurs organisations respectives afin de surmonter collectivement cette crise sanitaire sans précédent. Le Conseil de sécurité, qui assume en vertu de la Charte des Nations Unies la responsabilité principale du maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale, nous venons de célébrer le 75e anniversaire, il doit prendre en compte l'effet déstabilisateur des pandémies. Il l'a fait en 2000 avec le sida, il l'a fait en 2014 et en 2018 avec Ebola, et c'est bien ainsi. Je me réjouis par ailleurs qu'il ait pu, à l'unanimité et à travers la résolution qu'il a adoptée hier à l'initiative de la Tunisie, dont je salue le ministre Nourdine Herré, à l'initiative aussi de la France, je me réjouis qu'il ait pu répondre à la menace que fait peser la pandémie de Covid-19 sur la paix et la sécurité internationale. Nous devons maintenant redoubler d'efforts ensemble pour mettre en œuvre cette résolution. La France soutient l'appel du secrétaire général à un cessez-le-feu appuyé par près de 180 pays, par plus de 20 groupes armés, ainsi que de nombreuses organisations régionales et de la société civile. Cet appel-là doit aussi se traduire en actes. Et en Syrie, au Yémen, en Libye, au Sahel ou encore en Afghanistan, la situation reste extrêmement instable et les populations civiles continuent d'en payer le prix. Je tiens aussi à saluer le travail remarquable des casques bleus dans des conditions parfois très difficiles. Nous devons collectivement soutenir les opérations de maintien de la paix en leur permettant de mettre pleinement en œuvre leur mandat. La France a récemment déployé une équipe de décontamination au sein de la FINUL au Liban afin d'apporter une expertise et un soutien technique dans la lutte contre la pandémie. Et nous sommes prêts à accueillir dans nos hôpitaux militaires des soldats étrangers engagés en opération de paix, malades de la Covid-19 et nécessitant des soins urgents. Sur le plan humanitaire, je souhaite aussi rendre hommage au travail mené par les personnels humanitaires et médicaux, notamment le personnel du CICR. La France, tant par son appui bilatéral que sa mobilisation dans les enceintes internationales, a répondu présente et restera pleinement active dans les semaines et les mois à venir. Nous devons ensemble continuer à soutenir la pleine mise en œuvre du plan global de réponse humanitaire à la Covid-19 dans tous ses éléments, ce qui inclut le soutien apporté aux déplacés internes, aux réfugiés, ainsi que la défense des droits et de la santé sexuelle et reproductive des femmes qui sont en première ligne de la réponse aux pandémies et dont les droits doivent être préservés et renforcés. Ce sera l'un des objectifs du Forum Génération Égalité qui sera organisé en France au premier semestre 2021 en partenariat avec le Mexique et ONU Femmes. Cela constituera la prochaine grande étape internationale pour la promotion des droits de la femme. Tout doit également être fait pour faciliter l'accès humanitaire aux populations vulnérables et pour s'assurer que les personnels humanitaires et médicaux ainsi que leurs infrastructures ne font pas l'objet d'attaques. À cet égard, il nous faut poursuivre notre mobilisation en faveur du respect du droit international humanitaire. C'est le sens de l'appel à l'action humanitaire porté par la France et l'Allemagne dans le cadre de l'Alliance pour le multilatéralisme avec l'appui du CICR et cet appel a été soutenu par 45 États. Nous devons également renforcer l'accès à une information fiable et lutter plus efficacement contre les fausses rumeurs, les infodémies et les discours de haine qui peuvent prospérer sur les peurs collectives dans un contexte de crise mondiale. Enfin, nous ne pouvons ignorer l'impact socio-économique considérable de cette crise. Les causes profondes des conflits n'en seront qu'aggravées, renforcement des inégalités, perte de confiance dans les institutions, tensions dans la répartition des ressources naturelles, désorganisation ou rupture des chaînes d'approvisionnement, crise climatique. Nous portons à cet égard une responsabilité collective, celle de repenser le monde d'après et d'atténuer autant que possible les conséquences économiques et sociales de cette crise. Pour cela, l'agenda 2030 et l'accord de Paris sur le climat doivent demeurer notre cadre de référence. En effet, cette crise est venue confirmer, s'il en était besoin, la pertinence des objectifs de développement durable en soulignant combien l'interaction peut être forte entre les enjeux de santé et les enjeux environnementaux. Nous avons également besoin d'une architecture multilatérale de santé adaptée aux défis d'aujourd'hui. Cela suppose en particulier de renforcer au sein de l'OMS, seule organisation de santé publique universelle, notre capacité d'alerte collective pour être à même de régler très rapidement des crises d'envergure mondiale. Cela requiert également que les États exercent pleinement leurs responsabilités pour garantir la mise en œuvre effective du règlement sanitaire international qui fait encore trop souvent défaut. Il nous faut aussi travailler au renforcement des systèmes nationaux de santé et de leur résilience. Il nous faut poursuivre nos efforts pour faire de la couverture santé universelle une réalité, autant de chantiers auxquels nous devrons nous atteler en tirant toutes les leçons de la crise que nous traversons. Nous l'avons rappelé le 26 juin dernier avec EICOMAS lors de la dernière réunion de l'Alliance pour le multilatéralisme. Seul un multilatéralisme fort permettra de surmonter ensemble ces nouveaux défis. Être multilatéraliste, ce n'est ni être dogmatique, ni être idéologue. C'est plaider pour la seule méthode efficace, car il n'y a pas d'alternative à l'unité et à la coopération pour répondre à nos problèmes communs et la France est déterminée à continuer à œuvrer dans ce sens. Je vous remercie.
thank His Excellency Mr. Le Drian for his statement. Merci beaucoup, Jean-Yves. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Noureddin Eray, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Tunisia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Permettez-moi tout d'abord de féliciter mon ami le ministre Jean-Yves, Monsieur le secrétaire général des Nations Unies et tous les membres du Conseil de sécurité pour l'adoption à l'unanimité de la résolution historique 2532, initiée par la Tunisie et la France. Mr. President, let me first congratulate you on assuming the presidency of the Security Council in July. Wish you all success and ensure you of our full support. We thank Germany for convening this high-level open debate on pandemics and security. I welcome the Secretary General, thank him for his briefing and commend his leadership in mobilizing the UN system and the international community in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. I thank also the President of the International Committee for the Red Cross and the representative of the African Union for their briefings. Mr. President, with the outbreak of COVID-19 pandemic, the world has clearly embarked on a volatile and unstable new phase. For the first time in living memory, humanity is confronting a common threat, and it must defeat collectively. Since the early weeks of the pandemic, at the initiative of Tunisia and France, and with the support and the help of the E10, Council members started working on a draft resolution to address the impact of COVID-19 on issues under its mandate. As we all know, the process was long and difficult. We all tried hard to beyond our divergent view and concerns. And just yesterday, July 1st, we finally managed to prioritize the interest of the international community. This resolution, even though adopted after a delay of 3 months, bears an important message that consensus is possible should there be a political will. A message of hope and renewed faith in multilateralism. I take this opportunity to congratulate all Security Council members for the unanimous adoption of important resolution and thank them for their support and constructive engagement. In this regard, Tunisia shares the Secretary General assessment concerning the impact of this pandemic on peace and security. As outlined in his statement before his Council on 9th April 2020, my country fully supports all the initiatives and measures he proposed to mitigate the potential impact of the pandemic, especially in the conflict-affected areas, in particular his appeal for an immediate global ceasefire and the launching of the global humanitarian response plan for COVID-19 by the UN. At the same time, we commend the leading role of the UN system in coordinating the global response to COVID-19, and we support in this regard the central contribution of the World Health Organization to these efforts. Mr. President, the COVID-19 pandemic has reversed our assumption about the current world order. It is telling us that the hierarchy of global security threats is changing rapidly, and we are dealing with new global enemies, and that no country, no matter how developed it is, will be immune from its impact. Obviously, we can expect the impact of even more devastating in less developed countries and on vulnerable populations. Tunisia profoundly believes that we will not be able to defeat this pandemic in each of our countries without solidarity and unity, and the international, regional, and national levels. Solidarity because no one of us can face this huge challenge alone. Unity because the virus will use all weaknesses in our local, national, and international system to spread and kill. We should never forget that no one is immune until everyone is immune. Beyond the heavy death toll of more than 500,000 persons and immediate health consequences of the pandemic, the global economy is heading towards another Great Depression. As food supplies are coming under strain, prices are getting higher, and employment is rising, especially in fragile societies or less developed countries. This will translate into food insecurity and could quickly escalate to political unrest, violence, and conflict. Tensions are already flaring around the world, are not just in war zones. In conflict settings, the situation could be even more worse. The uncertainty created by the pandemic encouraged some actors to promote further division and turmoil, leading to escalation of violence and disastrous consequences on civilians and vulnerable persons, especially internally displaced persons and refugees. I take this opportunity to pay tribute to all UN troops in peace operations, as well as to humanitarian actors and relief persons providing support to contain the pandemic and to ensure unhindered delivery of humanitarian assistance to these vulnerable populations, sometimes risking their lives in pandemic context. In conclusion, Mr. President, as we commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, it is important to recognize that humanity is witnessing nowadays new types of threats to international peace and security, emanating not only from pandemics, but also from climate change and cyber criminality. As the nature and scope of threats evolve, we need to rethink security, adapt our approaches and tools. It's clear that we cannot face such dangers using the same instrument we have inherited from the old times. A change of paradigm is highly needed. Tunisia strongly believes that the Security Council needs to discuss these issues more in depth to be able to deliver on its primary responsibility for maintenance of international peace and security. Thank you very much.
Your Excellency, thank you very much for your statement. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Omar Salu, Minister for Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Estonia. Omar, the floor is yours.
Mr. President, first of all, I congratulate France for a great presidency and also Germany for assuming the presidency of this council in July. And let me first express my full sympathy and solidarity with all the people and nations of the world suffering from the coronavirus. The coronavirus crisis has demonstrated how crucial multilateral cooperation is to our collective health, prosperity, and security. And unfortunately, it seems likely that we are to remain seized with this crisis for quite some time. Thus, the global security implications of the coronavirus disease must remain under our close and constant scrutiny. It is truly important that the Security Council finally agreed upon a resolution on coronavirus, and this must be seen as a unified and clear call to put the guns down now. I thank particularly France and Tunisia for their leadership on this matter, and this confirms that also this Council must remain regularly involved with the peace and security implications of the virus. It also means that we shall listen to the wise advice and observations of the Secretary General, and allow me to congratulate Mr. Guterres also for being a visible and vocal voice of the UN nations family during this ongoing crisis.
The virus outbreak has clearly highlighted how crucial it is to have a safe and reliable digital infrastructure, that we must collectively work towards a more stable and secure cyberspace. Since the start of the pandemic, we are observing with worry an increase in attacks against one of the most important infrastructure sector, hospitals. Actors that use cyberspace for malicious purposes will be investigated, and these attacks will not remain unnoticed. We raised the cybersecurity topic at the UN Security Council Area Formula meeting in May, where the majority of participating states reaffirmed their commitment to follow commonly agreed rules of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, and we should all remain seized with this topic also in the future. The ongoing global pandemic has revealed serious risks brought by uneven digital transformation and weak digital infrastructure. The global digital divide must be rapidly addressed by all of us, including the private sector, which can drive the necessary innovation. That is why Estonia and the United Arab Emirates will cooperate to organize a global business summit to involve the business sector in addressing grave effects of the coronavirus disease. Digital technology and digital development can make societies more resilient to the outside shocks we are living through right now. And that is why Estonia, together with Singapore, convened yesterday an international high-level meeting on the global digital divide and COVID-19. And we also launched a global declaration on digital response to coronavirus there. And this text remains open for co-sponsorship, and more than 30 countries have already joined it. And I hope to welcome many, many more. Dear colleagues, while being busy with the ongoing crisis, we should also make sure that people get accurate and science-based information about the coronavirus disease. The Secretary General has wisely said that we shall be flooding the public, and I quote, with facts and science while countering the growing scourge of misinformation, a poison that is putting even more lives at risk. Thus, it is important that our response to the pandemic would not hamper the free flow of information. We can only succeed when the freedom of expression and the role of free, independent, and pluralistic media, online and offline, is secured. Failing here, we fail with our responses. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom. These are the words by Professor Timothy Snyder from US. We observe with concern how the global pandemic is used as a pretext to call for the termination of sanctions or to impede access to humanitarian aid. We call for unimpeded humanitarian access in Syria, where all arguments not to extend and widen the UN cross-border aid mechanism in July don't correspond to the reality on the ground. We regret to see that in some areas the pandemic is used as a pretext to curb peacekeepers' freedom of movement by accusing them in spreading the virus. We must ensure that all responses to coronavirus disease are in full compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law. To conclude with, the current crisis and past pandemics have shown that it takes a coordinated global effort to roll back global suffering. If coronavirus is left to ravage those with weaker healthcare systems, it will soon spread back to the other countries. This is a reality. We are only as strong as the weakest link in the global health system. Thank you very much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Reinfeldt for his statement. Thank you very much, Omas. And now I give the floor to His Excellency Lord Tariq Ahmad of Wimbledon, Minister of State for the Commonwealth, the United Nations and South Asia of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Heike, it's lovely to see you again and join you all for this important meeting. And we wish you well for your presidency of the Security Council. And it is important that we convene together to discuss this subject. And in doing so, I join others in paying tribute, particularly at this time of a global pandemic, to the leadership of the Secretary General and thank ICRC President Mr. Maurer and Mrs. El Fadil Mohammed for their very helpful and constructive briefings this morning. We all know that with COVID-19, we face a crisis of unprecedented scope and indeed complexity. Across the world, it has triggered health, humanitarian, economic development and security challenges, with ramifications that are both immediate and indeed long-term. These challenges are interwoven. They require a coordinated, collaborative response. Therefore, may I first welcome the adoption unanimously of UN Security Council Resolution 2532 yesterday, and doing so wish to thank both France and Tunisia for their efforts in this respect. Mr. President, the full extent of this pandemic is still unfolding before our eyes. I know we all fear its impact as it spreads into states that are both vulnerable or affected by conflict. As we see around the world in places such as Yemen, Libya, and the Central African Republic, contested or fragmented government authority severely restricts local capacity to respond effectively to the spread of this pandemic. Health systems are overstretched and under-resourced and cannot detect and indeed monitor the spread of the disease. As the impact becomes clearer, so we see evidence of COVID compounding existing problems, such as in the Lake Chad Basin and in the Sahel. Our efforts to prevent or resolve conflict there are complicated by COVID-19. Peacekeepers themselves are quarantined. Humanitarian access is restricted and impeded, and peace processes have been paused. So it is important we must both act to tackle the pandemic and to give an effective response to prevent or resolve conflict. We must ensure a strong international health response led by the World Health Organization. And in this regard, the United Kingdom has already committed £764 million to support humanitarian and public health needs. We must ensure development and equitable distribution of a vaccine. And in this regard, the United Kingdom has already pledged over £300 million in funding for research into vaccines, tests and treatment. And as many of you know, last month, we hosted a very successful global vaccine summit that raised over $8.8 billion to support immunization of 300 million children against coronavirus and indeed other vaccine-preventable diseases. At the same time, we must of course redouble our efforts on peace and security. This Council, the Security Council, has a key role to play. We welcome the Secretary-General's call for a global ceasefire, and we should all stand firm on our peacekeeping troop contributions and, importantly, the resources they need. The devastating impact of COVID-19 on fragile societies underlines the moral duty of outside parties that influence conflicts in Syria and indeed elsewhere. Importantly, everyone must come together to support peace. We need to also act smartly to prevent new peace and security crises from emerging. The pandemic has clearly demonstrated the importance of the coordinated and multi-dimensional international responses for which the UK has long argued. The United Nations must work smarter across its pillars and with partners. And we commend the UN system for delivering pressure. But clearly, I think we all acknowledge that more is needed to deliver that limits instability of complex. We therefore recommend 3 actions. Firstly, UN responses must be more sensitive to conflict risk and build this into strategic planning, prioritization and financing. Secondly, there needs to be a joint risk assessment and planning with the international financial institutions to combine macroeconomic, social and political considerations. And thirdly, we need to focus on what works to build a country's resilience to shocks. Strong, inclusive and accountable institutions, the rule of law, good governance and human rights are the fundamental basis of that very resilience. We need to see this in our coordinated response and in our planning to build back better. Mr. President, this pandemic has brought into sharp focus the urgent needs, the development objectives and sustainable peace and security cannot be solved as separate issues, and they cannot be solved alone. Together, we have this expertise. Together, we have the resources. We must use them and respond to this challenge. And together, we will succeed. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Lord Ahmad for his statement. Thank you very much, Tariq. Now I give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Tu An Sung, the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Vietnam.
Mr. President, I would like to sincerely thank the German presidency for organizing this open debate on pandemics and security, and the UN Secretary General and other briefers for their comprehensive briefings. Over the past month, the COVID-19 pandemic has spread across the globe, both in intensity and scope, and left far-reaching implications on every aspect of international situation. This greatest challenge ever to the United Nations has vividly shown us how a global health crisis and non-traditional security threats to a larger extent could instill profound consequences on peace, security, and prosperity of every member state. No single country can win this war against COVID-19 unless and until everyone wins. At this critical juncture, we should spare no efforts to strengthen international solidarity and cooperation towards promptly response to pandemics and sustainable socio-economic recovery. Multilateral institutions, particularly the United Nations at the center, could play a pivotal role in leading and coordinating global efforts. Mr. President, to promote the corresponding role of the Council, our delegation wishes to make the following points. First, protecting health and lives of our people, particularly the most vulnerable from impacts of pandemics, remain the utmost priority and indeed the primary responsibility of every state. We therefore call on all parties to conflicts to heed the Secretary General call for an immediate global ceasefire and facilitate humanitarian activities to combat with the COVID-19 pandemic. Within its mandate, the Council should send a strong message to resonate this appeal and take every action needed to help de-escalate tension, build trust, reconcile, and promote peaceful dialogues towards lasting conflict settlement. In this connection, we welcome the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2532 and appreciate France and Tunisia leadership and determination in promoting the initiative to which Vietnam has actively and constructively contributed. Second, the Council should closely monitor and instruct UN peacekeeping mission and special political mission in collaboration with UN country team and specialized agencies, particularly the World Health Organization, to ensure safety, security, and health of all UN personnel on the field, and to effectively assist host countries to deal with this pandemic and prepare for the future infectious disease outbreaks. Vietnam commends our ongoing efforts of UN peace mission and other UN agencies, as well as the first-line responders in the fight against coronavirus. Third, we strongly support the UN Secretary General appeal to waive sanctions and can undermine countries' capacity to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. We also encourage the Council and Member States to work out appropriate measures to facilitate humanitarian assistance to countries under sanction to enable them to address this overwhelming health crisis more efficiently in the best interest of civilian population. Agencies, being fully aware of hazard of the pandemic, Vietnam has taken very early action against it. On the basis of whole of government approach, we have achieved encouraging initial results in keeping the pandemic under control and return to normal socio-economic activities. As the 2020 ASEAN Chair and a non-permanent member of Security Council, Vietnam has put forth initiatives and joint efforts in coordinating regional and international response to the pandemic and beyond. To the utmost of our capacity, we provided timely and practical assistance and shares our experience with various countries and also made a financial contribution to the WHO COVID-19 Response Fund. Vietnam is confident that with global solidarity and strengthened multilateralism as a common denominator, we will overcome hurdles ahead and seize new opportunities to build a brighter future envisioned in 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. I thank you for your attention.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Zhang for his statement. And now I give the floor to the representative of the Dominican Republic.
First of all, I'd like to congratulate Tunisia and France for the COVID resolution, and France under presidency, and take the opportunity, Minister Mas, to congratulate Germany for the Security Council presidency and the European presidency. We would like to thank the briefers for their statements and valuable considerations. The COVID-19 pandemic caught us without a warning, and the measures to face it and stop it simply overwhelmed the world. And as we navigate the current sort of suspense mode, we are not sure whether the aftermath will be even worse than the pandemic itself. But before we continue, the Dominican Republic would like to express its deepest condolences to the families of all those who have lost the battle to the virus, including the 754 Dominicans that we have very sadly seen go. Mr. President, the COVID-19 is racing its way around the world. The potential and unprecedented magnitude of its outbreak globally constitutes a threat to international peace and security, and could critically harm human security all across the world. It is already strangling the world's economy and putting an enormous strain in health resources. International cooperation is essential and should continue to be strengthened. We reiterate that a coordinated, global, and people-centered response with a renewed sense of solidarity and common humanity, and with particular emphasis on those most vulnerable, is crucial. In this regard, we commend the Secretary General, the World Health Organization, and other humanitarian organizations for their leadership and efforts to organize and coordinate a global approach to this pandemic that has brought to the surface existing needs and further created new ones. It has added yet another layer of suffering for already extremely vulnerable populations that live in a state of humanitarian crisis. People living in conflict contexts are deeply vulnerable to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, particularly persons with disability, children, women, older persons, refugees, internally displaced people, and those in overcrowded detention centers, camps, and densely populated areas. We must ensure that their protection and needs are prioritized and that ongoing humanitarian aid distribution and access are in line with international humanitarian law, but also the safety and health of aid workers and first responders. If appropriate prevention and response measures are not put in place urgently, food security is more at risk now than ever before. Yemen, already weakened by hunger and disease and with health systems devastated by the conflict, is now bracing for impact by the threats associated with COVID-19. Similarly, in Afghanistan and many other contexts, including in Latin America and the Caribbean, COVID-19 is developing into a perfect nightmare for millions of people, including children. We welcome the $2 billion global humanitarian response plan to fund the fight against COVID-19 in the world's poorest countries, which also should take into account countries in transition, and we commend the efforts that the IMF, the World Bank, and the Peace Building Fund are making in this respect. Developing countries must count with better access to COVID-19 research, data, and affordable access to medicines, vaccines, and medical equipment as outlined in GA Resolution 74/274, proudly endorsed by the Dominican Republic. Mr. President, education has been impacted around the world. While the closings of schools and universities are part of the mitigation measures, alternative education opportunities should be put in place. Lockdown exacerbates the situation of vulnerability of women and girls in our conflict, bringing other types of dangers such as gender-based violence. The pandemic has wider impacts for gender-based violence prevention and response effort. Therefore, all decision-making related to COVID-19 must count with the participation of women and youth in civil society. Young people are mobilizing their communities to help stop the spread of this virus, building trust and triggering community action. Partnership with young people to shape the response must be prioritized. We must articulate lessons learned and best practices, departing from those of the Security Council addressing SARS and HIV and AIDS and responding to the Ebola outbreak crisis. Finally, we reiterate the call by Security Council Resolution S/2020/607, just adopted yesterday, for all parties to conflict to put an end to all hostilities and facilitate the much-needed humanitarian operations that serve the needs of the affected people. I thank you.
Thank you very much to the representative of the Dominican Republic. And now I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you so much, Minister. And thanks for beginning Germany's UN Security Council presidency by discussing this global pandemic that continues to impact our lives every day. This is such an important issue, and we are very grateful that you've taken this as your first day on the presidency. So we express our sorrow for the deaths, illnesses, and other adverse consequences, including those affecting healthcare and humanitarian personnel as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. We welcome the tireless efforts of the Secretary General to provide counseling and support services to the United Nations personnel and their local and national partners involved in this urgent response effort. As we have spent the last few months adapting our lives and working methods to stop the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic, this is an opportune time to reflect on what we have learned, discuss the ongoing threat that health emergencies pose to international security, and discuss how we can fulfill our obligations to protect the most vulnerable communities. Early on, President Trump rightly pointed out the unquestionable need for complete transparency and the timely sharing of public health data and information with the international community. Our recent experiences have only further underscored that important point. Timely age and sex disaggregated data collection and accurate science-based analysis of the origins, characteristics, and spread of the virus also continue to be crucially important. The United States continues to lead the world in humanitarian and health assistance response to the COVID-19 pandemic. We are working directly with governments, multilateral organizations, NGOs, the private sector, academia, and research institutions, and other organizations responding on the ground to combat this virus in accordance with the international health regulations. The United States is leveraging our long-standing investments and years of experience through the Global Health Security Agenda, the U.S. President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, the President's Malaria Initiative, and numerous other initiatives to assist our partners in combating this pandemic and to build sustained global health security capacity to better prevent, detect, and respond to future infectious disease threats. The U.S. has already made available more than $1.3 billion in emergency health, humanitarian, and economic assistance to combat COVID-19, in addition to the funding we already provide to NGOs and international organizations. This assistance is part of more than $12 billion from the U.S. government to benefit the global response, including vaccine and therapeutic development, preparedness efforts, and humanitarian assistance. This is in addition to more than $170 billion in U.S. investments in global health and humanitarian assistance throughout the last decade. The U.S. global response to the pandemic is part of our All of America approach. In addition to the substantial U.S. government assistance, the American people continue to show their generosity through private businesses, nonprofit groups, faith-based organizations, and individual contributions. This has been a true priority for President Trump. We also support the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire while continuing to conduct legitimate counterterrorism operations. We call on parties to conflicts to respect existing ceasefire agreements or to conclude new agreements that would help conflict-affected communities access crucial aid and take steps to protect themselves from the virus. The international community must remain equally committed to maintaining our responses to ongoing humanitarian crises as well. This virus has not only claimed lives, but crippled economies and exacerbated already unbearable conditions for many around the world. The impact of this has been felt acutely by vulnerable and marginalized populations, and they are counting on each of us now more than ever. We have also seen the crucial role that women have had in the COVID-19 response. Women make up more than half of the healthcare force globally, serving on front lines around the world as medical professionals, emergency workers, caregivers, and other essential personnel who are courageously stepping up and responding to the needs of those affected by this pandemic. We thank them for their work, and we are all indebted to them for their contributions. Despite these contributions, the crisis has made a disproportionate social and economic impact on women and girls. In conflict areas where women and girls typically have limited access to healthcare facilities, those who contract the virus are especially susceptible to dire outcomes. Moreover, in contexts where women and girls are already at risk of violence, the necessary public health measures put in place to battle the spread of the virus, such as social distancing, self-quarantining, and stay-at-home orders, may further put them at risk of gender-based violence, particularly domestic violence. As part of our unprecedented humanitarian response to this pandemic, the Trump administration proudly supports organizations that are responding to the increased risk of violence against women. Our increased efforts include programs such as Voices Against Violence, the Gender-Based Violence Global Initiative, which provides emergency assistance to survivors and local civil society organizations. The United States also continues to support the UN Relief Refugee Agency and the UN Special Representative for Sexual Violence and Conflict to address violence against women globally throughout this crisis. As we think about the future of pandemics and the impacts on international security, we must learn from our experiences here and ensure protections are in place to account for at-risk groups. Together with the UN and other international partners, the Trump administration will continue leading the fight against this virus during this very crucial time. We will do all we can to ensure a world safer, a world more secure from infectious disease threats, now and in the future, because it is our responsibility to do so. Together, we will recover stronger. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President. First of all, I would like to welcome Your Excellency, Minister Mas, and thank you for presiding on this very important meeting. And I also would like to thank France for the successful presidency in June, and of course, congratulate my German colleague on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. I also would like to thank the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, President of the ICRC, Peter Maurer, and the AU Commissioner for Social Affairs, Amira Mohammed, for their briefings. These meetings take place as we are entering the so-called new normal. As the term implies, COVID-19 has touched many aspects of our lives in a profound way. The global economy is predicted to contract by -6 to -7%. The humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. The Secretary General has also been clear on how the COVID-19 pandemic has far-reaching impacts, including to the maintenance of peace and security. We have come to terms with this new reality and do our utmost to prepare for the occurrence of pandemics in the future. The pandemic ravaged as we are celebrating 75 years of the United Nations. So the big question is, will we be able to emerge stronger together? I would like to outline 3 lessons learned. First, we must formulate a coordinated international response. And the United Nations, as a multilateral body, must race to this task. Indonesia, with 5 other UN members, took the initiative to launch the first General Assembly resolution on global solidarity to fight the coronavirus, GA Resolution 74/270. Indonesia fully supports the Secretary General's call for an immediate global ceasefire, which has received many supports. We welcome the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2532 by the Security Council just yesterday in support of this call, albeit long overdue. We thank Tunisia and France, as well as others that have made this possible. We must ensure that this call manifests in real action by all parties to put armed conflicts on lockdown. We should also support the efforts by the Secretary General and his representatives to resolve conflict and pursue sustainable peace. We commend the efforts of the United Nations peacekeeping mission on the ground in assisting the host countries during the pandemic in close consultation with the countries concerned. We underline what the Secretary General mentioned just now on the importance of the safety of missions and peacekeepers. We also recognize Secretary General points on the issue of biological convention, as well as the importance of UNSC Resolution 1540. We have always championed community engagement and quite happy to hear that this is further amplified by Peter of ICRC just now, particularly on the importance of building trust for responses to be effective. The second point is managing disruption following the pandemic. Data is still raw and projections are still unclear on when the pandemic will dissipate. While the research is still ongoing in finding cure and vaccine, Nevertheless, its impact will likely to persist long after. This would create disruption in many areas. For countries in conflict and post-conflict situation, if not carefully managed, many gains might experience reversal due to this pandemic. The implementation of mitigation and containment strategies must have unintended results, including more strain on states' capacity to ensure security of its population and perpetuation of conditions that may lead to insecurity and instability. Thus, the probable uncertainties and pressures in the following period need to be seriously contained. The third point is the need for a long-term comprehensive strategy. The COVID-19 pandemic has made us reluctantly aware of our fragility. In many countries facing instability, even before the pandemic, we are aware of the myriads of challenges, be it political, economics, social, as well as security challenges. We must continue to equip ourselves to address and even prevent such challenges by developing and implementing a long-term comprehensive strategy, namely, to alleviate the humanitarian situation, to ensure provision of basic needs, including healthcare facilities and treatment, and to transform socio-economic condition of the people. Lastly, Mr. President, the main lesson we must take in the hardest way is that this pandemic is a test of our solidarity and multilateral resolution. No one is immune, and no one can withstand alone. We must work together and enhance international cooperation, not only now, but for the long haul, to be safe and healthy, to find cure, to develop vaccine and produce them. We must ensure transfer of knowledge from vaccine producers to encourage the development of affordable vaccine and create a fair mechanism for its distribution so that countries obtain fair and equitable access to vaccine and medicine. I'm glad this important point was also highlighted by Ms. Mohammed from the African Union. We must ensure that all peoples from every corner of the world, from remote region to conflict areas, are given a fair chance to face these pandemic challenges. Only through concerted efforts can we tackle these enormous challenges in this unprecedented of time. No one should be left behind. We are in this together. Multilateralism now is being tested more than ever. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much to the representative of Indonesia. And now I give the floor to the representative of South Africa.
Thank you, Minister Haego Mas, our President, for convening this briefing on the maintenance of international peace and security, focusing on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. We'd also like to congratulate France for the achievement and chairing the Council in June. Mr. President, allow us to thank Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, Mr. Peter Mura, for their respective briefings. And also thank our sister and Her Excellency, Amira Mohammed, the AU Commissioner for Social Affairs, for a detailed report on the AU collective effort to fight the pandemic in the African continent. This meeting, Mr. President, is opportune and is held following the anonymous adoption of Security Council resolution on COVID-19 pandemic in the context of maintenance of peace and security. By adopting Resolution 2532, the Security Council has finally pronounced on this global challenge and its possible peace and security implication. At the outset, I would like to reiterate my country's position that the attention of the Security Council on global public health emergencies should be clear and directly linked on issues that fall under the purview of the Council's mandate. We urge the Council to be cautious and not focusing on international public health matters and economic measures, which are more appropriately addressed by the broader United Nations system, UN Secretary General and General Assembly. As the members of the UN, we should aim to strengthen those parts of the UN system aimed at addressing global health matters and effectively respond to the context and extent of COVID ravages, acutely global nature of COVID-19 pandemic, necessitate strengthen multilateralism, strong global solidarity and coordination. The pandemic has exacerbated the humanitarian and socio-economic crisis, with particular devastating impact on those struggling to survive in conflict situations. Of specific interest and concern to the Security Council is COVID-19's disruption of the activities of peacekeeping missions and electoral processes in conflict situations, affecting process on conflict resolution processes and exacerbated the health risks and safety of peacekeepers. In this regard, SAGWA remain concerned about the impact of the pandemic, especially the potential to reverse the vital gains made in peace and political processes in conflict situations. I take this opportunity to address South African support for the UN General Secretary General call for global ceasefire and a humanitarian pause in order to focus due attention on the pandemic and attempt to mitigate its impact. This call is reiterated by the African Union. All parties to the conflict must seize on this opportunity to prioritize addressing humanitarian impact of the virus on conflict in general. The pandemic highlights the fundamental importance of unity and cooperation over divisions and violence in conflict in addressing common threats to humanity. South Africa commends the leadership and proactive action of the UN to put in place measures to protect the health and safety of peacekeepers and navigate through the effects of the pandemic. We take this moment to express our deepest condolences to the families of the peacekeepers who have lost their lives to COVID-19 and who continue to put their lives online in order to execute their mandate, and wish the speedy recovery to those who are still battling the pandemic. Mr. President, South Africa believes that this council can do more to alleviate the plight of innocent civilians affected by the armed conflict and the spread of COVID-19. I will come back to this issue later on. In this regard, the U.S. Secretary General has called for a waiving of unilateral coercive measures and sanctions in order to allow affected governments and societies to have the requisite resources to secure the much-needed life savings and medical supplies and personal protective equipment to respond to the pandemic. This council has been briefed on numerous times by the Secretariat and civil society representatives who have first-hand information on the situation they operate in and have clearly elaborated on the severe impact of sanctions on ordinary citizens. We regret that this council has not been able to take the necessary action to alleviate the impact of the pandemic on the humanitarian situation in affected conflict areas. Sanctions should be used to support peace processes and not as a means of collective punishment, which is made all more devastating in the context of the pandemic that even the most capable economies have been struggling to deal with, as the daily figures of both infections and death illustrate. Scientists tell us, Mr. President, that this virus is not going away very soon, with devastating consequences for all of us in all parts of the world. We are also deeply concerned about the plight of refugees, migrant internally displaced persons whose difficult living conditions have been further exacerbated by the effects of COVID-19 pandemic. South Africa wishes to pay tribute to the bravery of the health workers and humanitarian personnel whose perseverance and commitment to save lives in the face of COVID-19 is commendable. It is paramount that they are provided with adequate and appropriate supplies to enable them to better perform their work. In this regard, South Africa reaffirms its firm support for the leadership and critical role of the World Health Organization in preventing and mitigating public health emergencies and the centrality of the United Nations leading multilateral response to COVID-19 pandemic. We further reaffirm the indispensable role of the World Health Organization and commend the work of the organization in assisting affected countries and regional organizations to address the spread of COVID-19. In this regard, we underscore the vital importance for the national, regional, international organizations and support to coordinate and cooperate with the Health Organization in order to formulate an appropriate global response to COVID-19 pandemic. The WHO role is central to this global response and should therefore continue to be supported and capacitated. The spread of the virus in an increasingly globalized world has shown that we are all only as strong as our weakest link. Therefore, sustained support and assistance to those most in need will prove vital in ensuring that we emerge from this global crisis together. Mr. President, 500,000 of our people worldwide has been consumed by the pandemic. Millions are lying in beds across the world, gasping for air to live, and others, millions, are either in isolation or self-quarantine in cities, towns, townships, and villages, hoping to beat
Okay, I think we have a technical problem.
and support.
Okay. Please go on.
Mr. President, can you hear me? Thank
Now
you.
we can hear you again.
Mr. President, can you hear me? Or am I out?
I can hear you, but I can't see you. But we can hear you clearly.
Mr. President, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. But can you hear us?
I was saying, Mr. President, if you hear me, I don't hear you. But if you hear me, I was saying that millions of our people are either in isolation or in self-quarantine in cities, towns, township, villages, hoping to beat the pandemic. All these people expect us to unite, coordinate our action, cooperate and support those specialized agencies leading the war against the coronavirus pandemic. It extends solidarity to all UN member states battling this pandemic. In conclusion, Mr. President, we'd like to propose that everything be done to assist those trapped in conflict situation worldwide by declaring that all water points, clinics and health facilities, schools and education facilities be declared neutral so that ICRC, local Red Cross societies, UNICEF and specialized agencies can continue to deliver basic services, especially to women and children, so as to save our future. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much to the representative of South Africa, and now I give the floor to the representative of Niger.
Mr. President, Niger congratulates your delegation on assuming the presidency of the Security Council for this month. The participation of many honorable ministers in today's open debate is a testimony to the timelessness of the choice of theme, which is the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on international peace and security. I wish also to thank the Secretary General and Ms. Moura for their briefing. Thanks to AU Commissioner Amira Al-Fadil for joining us from Addis Ababa. Mr. President, we have witnessed how in a short period of time, the COVID-19 pandemic has overwhelmed the capacities of countries, some with the most advanced healthcare systems. Today, 10 million people have been infected and 500,000 have unfortunately passed away. We would like to extend our deep gratitude to all frontline workers in the fight against this scourge and convey our condolences to all those who have lost loved ones. As the COVID-19 spread, one of its inevitable consequences has been its impact on the international conflict resolution mechanism and the humanitarian aid sector. The privilege bestowed upon this very council as the most important crisis management entity in the world, with the power to pass enforceable decisions binding to all member states, has also suffered greatly. However, despite the 3 months delay, we align ourselves and welcome the adoption yesterday of a resolution in support of the Secretary General call for a global humanitarian ceasefire as part of the fight against the pandemic. Thanks to France and Tunisia for bringing us there. Unfortunately, on the ground, the ceasefire appeal made by Secretary General is mostly not being heeded by belligerent parties, as is the case in the Sahel, where terrorist groups are trying to take advantage of the pandemic to destabilize government by ramping up their attacks on civilian and military targets alike. These acts have caused the loss of innocent lives and major disruptions to the delivery of basic social services to the population. In the meantime, mediators, special envoys, and representatives are in the impossibility to travel and meet with the parties whom they are trying to bring to common ground in different conflict areas. The delivery of much-needed humanitarian assistance is slowed by border closures and many restrictions taken by member states in their effort to contain the spread of the pandemic. Peace operations are being heavily impacted by the freeze in rotations and the risk of the spread of the disease among the troops and the population they are protecting. We commend the United Nations for putting in place strict and effective measures aimed at minimizing and mitigating the impact of the pandemic in the different peace operations. Mr. President, as we all know, even in the best of times, persons in conflict zones face vulnerabilities that render their livelihoods challenging. In the Sahel, an area where climate change, armed conflicts, and fragile healthcare systems intersect, the pandemic has added another layer to an already existing dire situation and made the populations particularly vulnerable to the outbreak of diseases and hunger. 3.5 million people are projected to face acute to severe food insecurity. 3.1 are internally displaced persons, returnees, and people at risk of statelessness. In addition to its heavy human and health toll, the pandemic is seriously affecting the already fragile economies of the G5 Sahel countries, with the risk of a serious contraction in gross domestic product that could reach 7 to 8% in 2020 for some countries, as mentioned in the final outcome of the French G5 Sahel summit held in Nouakchott on June 30, 2020. The global health crisis has become an economic and social crisis that generates socio-political and security crises that can worsen if a second wave is to materialize. We still believe a compassionate approach is necessary to overcome this current crisis, one that involves an easing or suspension of economic sanctions to allow countries to sustain their medical and economic response to the outbreak. Mr. President, crises such as this one calls on our collective conscience to draw inspiration from our recent past experience and from all places for solutions. As harmful as the 2014-2016 Ebola epidemic was for Africa, lessons learned from it might have shown us how to weather this current pandemic. The watchword seems to have been invest in preparedness. As we have seen with the Ebola, because viral diseases move faster than emergency and funding mechanisms. The African Union and the Africa Center for Disease Control and Prevention have worked early on with governments across the continent to scale up a comprehensive and evidence-based intervention to reduce and slow down the virus transmission, help health systems better manage the surge of patients and communities to better adapt to the disruption of social, cultural, and economic activities. At the national level, Niger continues to enforce and promote the protocols approved by the African Union and the World Health Organization. Despite the drop in cases, we remain vigilant and have ramped up surveillance, risk communication, community engagement, and coordination among the ECOWAS member states currently chaired by Niger. Furthermore, the use of social media to spread false information and propaganda on the pandemic is a major source of concern. This fake news is impeding government's response to COVID-19 by spreading conspiracy theories about the disease, stigmatizing groups of populations, and hatred. We welcome the United Nations launch of the Verified campaign, which is aimed at countering this misinformation with facts and scientific data. Therefore, as was the case during the Ebola outbreak in Africa, government must build trust, be trustful with the population, and ensure that the public receive accurate, timely, and appropriate information in order not to repeat mistakes that were costly in terms of allowing the disease to spread. In both crises, making sure that most of the information is locally contextualized and health experts are sharing it using local customs and practices was of priority. Mr. President, as we celebrate the 20th year anniversary of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, I cannot finish my remarks without paying tribute to and stressing the important role women play in any viable response efforts. Not only do they make up the majority of healthcare workers, thus putting them on the front lines of the infection, but they are also victims whenever crisis such as this occurs. The current COVID-19 crisis has also led the ground to another shadow pandemic, namely domestic violence against women and children. This is an area that we can and must do better. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Niger, and now I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, China welcomes Foreign Minister Mr. Mas in chairing today's open debate. We congratulate Germany on the assumption of Security Council presidency for the month of July and commend France for the enormous efforts made during its presidency in June. I also thank Secretary General, President of the ICRC Mr. Morrow, and the EU Commissioner for their briefings. The sudden outbreak of COVID-19 is wreaking havoc with the world, killing tens of thousands of people. We mourn for the deceased and express deep condolences to their families. We pay tribute to the frontline medical workers for their sacrifice and great contributions. COVID-19 continues to spread across the world. Countries all face the daunting tasks of fighting disease, saving lives, stabilizing economy, and ensuring livelihood. We must put people and life first, do our utmost to protect people's safety and health, and minimize the impact of the virus. The pandemic once again proves that we live in a global village and have a shared destiny. Solidarity and cooperation is the most powerful weapon in fighting the pandemic. China is ready to work with all parties, uphold the UN-centered international system, and support the WHO in contributing more to the global fight against COVID-19. Mr. President, COVID-19 has brought challenges to the maintenance of international peace and security. The Security Council should take actions in the following 4 aspects. First, accelerating the implementation of the Secretary General's appeal for a global ceasefire. The Security Council has adopted the resolution endorsing the appeal. The international community should seize the opportunity to encourage the parties to conflict, to respond to the appeal, immediately cease hostilities, jointly fight the pandemic, save lives, and seek peaceful settlement through political and diplomatic means. From the very beginning, China has been supportive of the Secretary General's appeal and is one of the 172 member states and observers that issued a joint statement in supporting the appeal. China has been constructively engaged in consultations on the draft resolution, worked tirelessly with most of the Council members to build the widest possible consensus, and showed maximum flexibility. As a result, we have managed to overcome all obstacles and ensure that the Council is able to send a positive message of solidarity and cooperation at this difficult time. In this regard, we thank the efforts made by France and Tunisia. Second, stepping up humanitarian assistance. The pandemic has exacerbated the humanitarian situation in the conflict regions and countries. China welcomes the global humanitarian response plan proposed by the Secretary General and highly appreciates the tireless efforts by WHO, ICRC, and other UN health and humanitarian specialized agencies in coordinating and providing health assistance. At the same time, humanitarian assistance should abide by the UN Charter and the principles established by GA Resolution 46/182. Special attention should be given to vulnerable groups such as women, children, the elderly, and persons with disabilities. Efforts should also be made to protect humanitarian workers. Third, making every effort to ensure safety and the security of peacekeepers. China appreciates the effective measures taken by the Secretariat and the peacekeeping missions to regulate the conduct of peacekeepers, increase medical devices, and readjust the replacement policies to bring down risks of infection for peacekeeping missions. We hope the member states and the Secretariat will continue to fully implement the Security Council Resolution 2518, help the troop contributing countries and the peacekeeping missions strengthen early warning, health support, critical medical capacity, and improve training and truly safeguard life and the health of peacekeepers. Fourth, supporting removal of unilateral coercive measures. Unilateral coercive measures run counter to multilateralism and contravene the basic norms of international relations. They undermine sanctioned countries' capacity to fight COVID-19 and ensure livelihood, making innocent civilians the biggest victims. The Security Council should actively respond to the Secretary General's appeal and urge relevant countries to act in a humanitarian spirit to immediately lift unilateral coercive measures amid COVID-19. The Security Council, bearing in mind its mandate, should also explore how to fundamentally eliminate unilateral coercive measures to lessen the sufferings of affected countries and peoples in the world. Mr. President, since the outbreak of COVID-19, China provided assistance in various forms to more than 150 countries and international organizations, including all those on the agenda of the Security Council. China has proposed the recommendations and measures on the global fight against the COVID-19, including its decisions to make its vaccine, once available, a global public good, provide $2 billion in international aid to affected countries, especially in developing countries, cancel government interest-free loans owned by African countries due to mature by the end of 2020, and implement the G20 debt service suspension initiative. To strengthen international coordination, China has also held an extraordinary China-Africa summit on solidarity against the COVID-19 and a high-level video conference for international cooperation in the framework of Belt and Road Initiative. Virus respects no borders or races. Solidarity and cooperation is the only right way. Politicizing and stigmatizing lead to nowhere. Countries should take up responsibilities, respect science, replace differences with unity, dispel prejudice with reason, form synergies in the global fight, and build a better future for all. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, too. Thank you to the representative of China. And now I give the floor to the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President. I begin by thanking our briefers for their purposeful remarks, and I commend the German presidency for convening this very timely discussion. The current pandemic has laid bare the critical weakness of a lopsided international system in which unbalanced global development undermines resilience and accentuates vulnerabilities, especially in the global south. For conflict-affected states, the complex and interrelated challenges of reducing hostilities, building and maintaining peace, and promoting social and economic development are made most urgent, while the key ingredient for the sustainable recovery is the unity and solidarity of the international community. Mr. President, as we have witnessed with COVID-19, public health emergencies are easily transfigured into international crises as they are fueled by and implicate upon travel, trade, and other globalized tools that keep our societies in motion. To stifle the pandemic, these very structures are often the first to be suspended, thereby exacerbating vulnerabilities not only in conflict-affected countries, but also for vulnerable groups elsewhere. A pertinent example is the thousands of seafarers that remain stranded aboard cruise ships and cargo vessels where they ply their trade, marooned as a result of border closures and immigration restrictions aimed at curbing the pandemic, but also due to owners and operators of maritime vessels who seek to abscond from their legal obligations toward them. As supply chains are interrupted, the delivery of life-saving humanitarian aid is delayed. Food insecurity is further exacerbated, and social tensions are deepened along ethnic, communal, and political lines as the social contract in conflict-affected communities is gradually unraveled. More urgently, as competition over natural resources intensify against the global backdrop of climate-induced shortages, painful cycles of violence are instigated that impact upon and are further impacted by the public health emergency. The interconnecting and overlapping health, socio-economic, political, and security risks associated with pandemics necessitate an integrated and coordinated strategy that brings the entire international community together to address each dimension of the crisis in a systematic manner. St. Vincent and the Grenadines reaffirms its support of the World Health Organization's key coordinating role, which ensures effective epidemic preparedness, prevention, and response within the framework of the international health regulations. In the midst of a pandemic, while we cast our collective gaze toward health cooperation, the peace-building initiatives that prevent the outbreak, escalation, continuation, and recurrence of conflict must be preserved and strengthened. More pressingly, we must adapt international public policy on several fronts to build capacities, ensure that inequalities are reduced, and create pathways for peace and justice that are accessible by all in accordance with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. To this end, our delegation welcomes the ongoing thrust to streamline peacekeeping operations under the Secretary General's A4P initiative, which brings political solutions to the forefront of our efforts to maintain international peace and security. In closing, Mr. President, St. Vincent and the Grenadines reiterates its support for the Secretary General's calls for a global ceasefire. And in this vein, we welcome the unanimous adoption of Resolution 2532, which, if upheld, will give vulnerable states the time and space to mend their social fabric. We congratulate France and Tunisia for their tireless efforts in bringing us to this unanimous adoption. We also advocate for the waiving of sanctions, unilateral or otherwise, that may undermine efforts to respond to the urgent health, socio-economic, political, and security challenges precipitated by the pandemic. While the most dangerous pathogens move with stealth, we must work assiduously to rebuild the social contracts upon which resilience is built. I thank you.
Thank you very much to the representative of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and now I give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President, Mr. Minister. We welcome you presiding over this meeting, and we congratulate Germany on assuming presidency of the Security Council in July and wish you all the success. Mr. President, we carefully listened to the briefing of the Secretary General. We would like to thank him for his initiatives on countering this serious challenge, and I'd like to remind that Russia supported the Secretary General's call for ceasefire. Next day, he issued his appeal. We also thank Peter Maurer, President of the International Committee of the Red Cross, and Commissioner Amira Mohammed for their briefings. Mr. President, we welcome the consensual adoption of the Security Council Resolution 2532 on COVID-19 and on the call on ceasefire. Against the background of the spread of the disease, which teaches us new lessons, we need to use also the experience of the international community in combating previous major outbreaks of infectious diseases, including Ebola. Pandemics can exacerbate the humanitarian consequences of armed conflict. Among other things, it affects food security through the disruption of agro-food systems and supply chains. Due to the COVID-19 related restrictions, important peace processes are being hindered. UN peacekeeping missions are experiencing additional difficulties in their work. We are concerned that countries that experience armed conflicts have faced deterioration in the humanitarian situation even before the pandemic. The continuation of armed conflicts is detrimental to the effective implementation of the required and necessary anti-epidemic measures. National health sectors also suffer not only through physical damage inflicted to the medical infrastructure by the hostilities, but also by the inability of national governments to reallocate necessary additional funding for healthcare. In this context, economic coercive measures have an extremely destructive effect on the ability of countries suffering under the burden of sanctions to purchase vital personal protective equipment and medications. The UN Secretary General repeatedly drew attention in his reports to the particular vulnerability of developing countries under unilateral restrictions. The current situation requires an urgent review and abolition of this illegal practice. By adopting yesterday a resolution, the Council made its contribution to raising awareness of this problem. Mr. President, we believe that the Council's efforts to help combating the pandemic should focus first and foremost on its impact on the functioning of peacekeeping missions, ensuring the continuity of peace processes, supporting the implementation of the Secretary General's initiative on ceasefire. The threats of a sharp deterioration in the humanitarian situation in armed conflicts under the influence of COVID-19 should be considered mostly in relation to the situation in specific countries that are on the Security Council agenda. Moreover, the Council has been doing that for the past 3 months, taking a nuanced approach to discussing the impact of the pandemic on the situation in a given country. Attempts to generalize such a discussion will clearly bring us outside the scope of the Council's mandate. As for the medical aspects of international response to the outbreak and global response to its socio-economic impact, there are relevant UN bodies and agencies, namely World Health Organization, UN General Assembly, and ECOSOC. Russian Federation has consistently advocated for the strengthening of the leading role of the WHO in international efforts in the field of health and response to outbreaks of infectious diseases, especially in coordinating multilateral efforts to counter COVID-19. In order to facilitate activities of this UN specialized agency, Russia allocated financial and methodological resources. Our national experts took part in WHO country missions to combat the outbreak of coronavirus. We consider it extremely important that the international community unanimously and unequivocally supports the work of WHO, which is at the forefront of this challenge today. Mr. President, we would like to assure that Russia will continue to make a significant contribution to global efforts to counter the pandemic and its consequences. Multilaterally, we are contributing through the WHO, UNDP, and other UN agencies. We continue our bilateral assistance to countries in need by providing personal protective equipment, test systems to 19 countries, and laboratory supplies, and sending medical teams upon request. In Russia, a number of innovative medicines for the treatment of coronavirus infection, as well as its most serious complications, have been developed based on the results of clinical studies. Our scientists continue research on other promising products, including vaccines against COVID-19. We are ready to cooperate with all interested partners to ensure a coordinated international response to the spread of the coronavirus and look forward to its early and final retreat. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. And now I give the floor to the representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. President, and congratulations to Germany for assuming the presidency. Congratulations also to France for a very successful presidency last month. Thank you, Mr. President, for calling the Council's attention on the issue of intertwined global health and security risks, and for inviting distinguished briefers to share their insights on this matter. At the outset, let me also welcome the unanimous adoption yesterday of the COVID-19 resolution by this Council. I would like to commend France and Tunisia for their efforts. It took a long time, but in the end, their perseverance has paid off. Mr. President, we share your concerns about the implications of global health risks for international peace and security. There can indeed be a threat multiplier in fragile or conflict situations and can undermine conflict prevention, as well as conflict resolution and peace-building efforts. When healthcare workers and facilities are regularly attacked during armed conflict, the very fabric of the health system is under attack, and as such, left ill-equipped to respond to a pandemic or global health crisis. The situation in Syria is unfortunately one of the best examples. 9 years of war have taken an extreme toll. Nearly half of all healthcare facilities have been severely damaged or destroyed. WHO has counted almost 500 attacks on healthcare workers and installations in the last 3 years. It has left thousands of IDPs in the region without access to any medical care. Healthcare in Syria needs our support, and the renewal of the cross-border resolution is therefore a key step towards that goal. The protection of healthcare and health workers in conflict situations, as this Council agreed to in Resolution 2286, needs our renewed attention indeed. Impunity for violations of international humanitarian law needs to end. As COVID-19 data are already showing us, a pandemic in turn further decimates the healthcare system. Hate speech, stigmatization, fake news, and even sometimes coercion are further fueling violence against healthcare workers. Vaccination campaigns are being interrupted, and services like sexual and reproductive health care are being deprioritized. Past epidemics have shown the toll of such a deprioritization. Maternal mortality increased by 75% in West Africa during the Ebola epidemic of 2004-2016. Previous experiences with Ebola outbreaks in the DRC, for example, have also demonstrated how mistrust and misinformation undermine not only an effective response to Ebola, but also community engagement and conflict resolution efforts. Armed groups often use the gaps left by the health crisis to expand their grip over populations. Without trust of the population, a health system will not work, nor will the response and measures enforced to combat a pandemic, nor will any humanitarian or peace-building efforts. All measures undertaken in such fragile contexts should therefore be conflict-sensitive and context-based in order to avoid fueling grievances which could lead to further tensions. COVID-19 has further demonstrated the far-reaching effects of a pandemic on the operational capacity of UN peace operations, which have had to adapt their operations to help prevent the spread of the virus. The pandemic has impacted mobility of personnel and engagement with local communities. There will be a time to analyze and draw lessons from these experiences and to incorporate them into the work of UN peace operations. The Military Staff Committee and the C-34 would greatly benefit from such an analysis. Mr. President, Belgium supports the World Health Organization in its leading role of the comprehensive health response. And we are contributing to these efforts. We are also supporting medical evacuations of UN and UN peace operations personnel. And the EU and its member states have spared no efforts. Under the Team Europe approach, we have mobilized over 36 billion euro for the global COVID-19 response and recovery. But as we know, COVID-19 is not just a health, nor just a humanitarian crisis. It is an economic crisis, it is a security crisis, it is a protection and a human rights crisis. The consequences of these combined shocks can fuel existing tensions and undermine conflict prevention and conflict resolution, as well as peace-building efforts. To fight these multiple crises, a coordinated global response supported by multilateral efforts is needed. Belgium fully agrees with the Secretary General that coming out of this crisis will require a whole of society, whole of government, and actually whole of the world approach. I thank you.
Thank you very much to the representative of Belgium. And I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs of Germany. Colleagues, Excellencies, the world is facing its biggest crisis since 1945. More than 500,000 people have already died from a virus which we don't yet have a cure for, and many more could follow. The emergency braking in the global economy will deepen humanitarian crisis and destroy trust in state institutions. We have heard from our briefers how conflicts are spiraling out of control, especially in Africa and in war-torn countries such as Yemen and Libya. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday this Council finally sent a sign of unity by endorsing the Secretary General's call for a global ceasefire. Resolution 2532 was long overdue. And let us now implement it together by working towards country-specific ceasefires. We all know that they can facilitate humanitarian access and serve as entry points for political talks. Today's meeting can also be a launching pad to address major health risks and their security implications more systematically. To do so, we should agree on 3 lines of action. First, we must address the effects that pandemics have on the conflicts and humanitarian crisis on the Council's agenda. United Nations peace operations themselves will need to adapt by monitoring the fast-changing dynamics of conflict, by protecting the health of staff and local population, and by keeping the mission fully operational. This is why Germany, together with other EU member states, has signed a letter assuring the Secretary General that we will uphold our military, police, and civilian contributions. Second, safe, unhindered, and rapid access for humanitarian workers and medical experts is even more important during a pandemic. It is the obligation of this Council and other member states involved to make this happen. We also heard the Secretary General's call for immediate steps to ensure that COVID-19 does not reverse progress achieved in gender equality and women's participation in peace processes. Germany therefore contributed 4 million euros to the COVID-19 emergency window of the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, and we call others to follow suit. Third, this Council must finally embrace a broader understanding of peace and security. The founders of the United Nations may well have had artillery, bombers, and soldiers in mind when they drafted the Charter. Today we know that a virus can be deadlier than a gun, that a cyber attack can cause more harm than a soldier, and that climate change threatens more people than most conventional weapons. Closing our eyes to this reality means refusing to learn. What we need is early preventive action based on good reporting and adequate capacities in the United Nations system. This is what maintaining peace and security means in the 21st century. Thank you very much. And now I resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. And then the meeting is adjourned. Thank you very much.